Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope you're excited for a totally, completely, unquestionably original video idea that I definitely made up. For real though, this definitely is a video that has been done before, reacting to a little bit lower rated reviews of books that you really enjoy. I personally got this idea most prominently personally from Murphy Napier and Benjamin McAvoy, are a couple people who I can recall off the top of my head who have done these and for whom I've watched videos for. And so for me personally, they're the inspirations for this video specifically, but like I said, this is definitely one that's been done a lot, far from an original concept, but I think it'll make for an enjoyable video nonetheless. In case you missed my favorite books of all time video that I did back in late May, I believe it was, where I talked about my 15 favorite books of all time. I included, I think, 5 honorable mentions with that. This video is going to be based basically off of that list. I think I'm running off of the top 10 books of all time, my personal 10 favorites. So if you want to be surprised by that list or see what the 5 to 10 other favorites that don't make the top 10 are, you can watch that video. But this video definitely runs off of that list, just in case you were curious. This series will also likely be a series. I'll probably do a part 2 at some point. I don't know, maybe I'll have enough content just from this very recording to be able to make 2 parts out of it. I had a handful of friends go and collect some reviews for me. A number of reviews from a few of them. Good chance that maybe a couple of them with a couple of these books end up being the same. So, some of these sections are probably going to be a little bit longer than others, but we'll see how things go. I'm sure I'll do at least a part 2 to cover books 11 through basically 20 in this case, but we'll see how things end up going with just this first one. So I'm actually including this in about halfway through recording this video at this point. I'm only going to be covering my 10th through 6th favorite books. So the first 5 of the 10 books for this video, I'll go through and the reviews that I was given for books 5 through 1 at a later point, almost certainly next month in November. It just turned out that this was very long, and I expected it to be long, but not quite as long as it is. So I'm sorry, but this is going to have to be a 2-parter at the very least. Like I said, I asked a few friends to collect some of these reviews for me, so we'll move over to my desktop here and we'll start looking over some of these reviews. So yeah, we'll start off with my number 10 book of all time, and that is The Shining by Stephen King. Okay, so this first review that was sent to me by my friend Long Sun Malrubius may contain some spoilers for The Shining, apparently, so I'll put a time code on screen for you to be able to skip to if you don't want any spoilers for the book. Let's head into the review. I am not a King fan, and I don't like this book. Insanity, sadness, loss, the evil dad, what a joy! The discussion below may contain spoilers, so let's look at it. This is in many ways a The Place Destroys the Family book. Yes, it's been done before, and yes, the idea isn't new. The haunted house that basically devours a character or characters and destroys the entire family or kills off the entire family isn't new with Mr. King, but he does it to the hilt. Of course, the underlying state of the protagonist/antagonist is also in question here. Was he simply susceptible? Then of course the story of Danny is really the story of The Shining, but it never lightened the book enough to remove the oppression. It only made the boy more susceptible to the horror. Other books I read put me deeply in mind of this book, Burnt Offerings or even Honeycomb's Dragon Under the Hill, even though it predates this book. I haven't actually read either of those, so I don't know what references specifically are being made in that way. Maybe it influenced King, he says. Whatever your take on the quality of the writing here, and Mr. King is at least a capable writer, and often far better than just capable. On that note, I will actually agree. People underrate King's prose, actually. I think you'll find that the book carries with it a crushing sense of impending doom. That is true, actually. Yeah, I definitely felt that a lot, to the degree that when I was reading it and I wasn't quite used to really falling head over heels, just engaged with the book to a degree that I was with this, I had to stop reading for a couple of days just because I was so engrossed with it. So yeah, I'll agree on that point. From the moment I met Jack, I never had any doubt how this thing would play out. Yeah, fair enough. But for me, that was because of the zeitgeist. I knew what would happen to him, at least. The only light at the end of the tunnel was the proverbial approaching train, and even a good glass of red rum wouldn't hide it. Some will have read other reviews by me and will know that crushing negative impending doom with a healthy side dish of nihilism is pretty much guaranteed to get a low rating from me. In this case, while Mr. King's writing is workmanlike and does the job, there's little surprise in the eventual outcome. It's just a trek through the horrors and pain to get there. Not my cup of tea. If you like it, enjoy. I didn't. Honestly, very fair. Totally. Like, if you don't like any of that crushing, negative, impending doom, well, maybe, I don't even know if I would use negative personally, but definitely in terms of, like, the impending doom, that kind of crushing sense of eventuality, yeah, you might not like The Shining, because that is a lot of what it does well, is definitely that. So, if you don't like that, and you give that 1 star for that reason, totally valid. I get it. Let's move on to the next review. The next review from Chris here says, my 2 biggest complaints with this book were, 1, domestic violence is only scary to those living it. To the rest of us, it serves only to anger. I spend far too much of the book furious at Wendy for being such a damned dish rag and loser than in actually being afraid of anything. I'm not sure I personally agree with that take, but I could totally see where you're coming from if that's how you feel in that regard. Domestic violence is only scary to those living it. I would personally take issue with that. I don't think that's true. I do think that domestic violence, like, to me specifically, is kind of a frightening thing. Not just, angering. It is kind of frightening in its own way, even as somebody who has not experienced any of that personally. So, I'll take issue with that critique, but if that's how you feel, fair enough. I can't really argue with that. But in terms of being furious at Wendy for being a dish rag, I guess I could also see it, but I think that definitely lacks a little bit of compassion for people with that personality type. Wendy's definitely a very real character. That's one of my favorite things about The Shining, is Wendy and Jack are both incredibly well-written characters. So if you don't like Wendy for being a dish rag, I guess fair enough, like, from a reading experience, but for me, she felt like a real enough person that didn't bother me. And then 2, the damn book went on and on and on and on and on ad nauseum, at least 100 pages of repetitious description of things meant to be terrifying, but in reality were more the potty language of 8-year-old boys, could have been removed and never be missed. The point when I nearly put it down was when the boy, who was about 5, witnessed 2 music box dancers, I believe that's what they were, have oral sex and was disgusted. I thought, this is supposed to scare me, offend me, yes, but scare me, no. I knew it was all downhill from there. So a couple points on that is, not everything is meant to be terrifying per se. That's kind of the issue with horror, is there's multiple ways to do it, and things actually being scary is often not actually necessarily the point. There's more facets to horror, and sometimes disgust is one of those facets. So if that's not something that you're into, fair enough, but I think it's somewhat unfair to insinuate that something being disgusting or gross to some degree, or to offend rather than scare against a horror book, is not necessarily the right angle, unless you were expecting, based off of reputation, for something to be scary, and it wasn't scary. For me, I actually personally wouldn't define The Shining as being necessarily scary. For example, I think that the iconic room scene that everybody says is like one of the scariest things, I didn't find that scene very scary at all, for example. And also, fear is one of those very personal things. If you don't find something scary, that is definitely a matter of what actually does scare you personally. Some people are going to react to some things differently than other people, and that's totally fair. But as for the initial point there about the book going on and on and on, I would personally definitely disagree with that. I loved every minute of this book, and couldn't get enough of it, really. I thought it was exactly long enough. I definitely didn't feel like it went on too long, and I don't feel like it was too short either, unlike some of the other things that I've read from King, where it's like, I don't know, you could have done a little bit more with that. But you know, I could see why somebody wouldn't like it though. It's like 500 pages, but for me, I think it's a little bit lengthy-ish, but like for me, King's prose just reads so quickly that I don't personally see how somebody could see the book going on and on and on. But if you're not into what it's doing as far as like the descent into madness from Jack Torrance, then fair enough. Like I suppose I could see it going on and on, but that's something that you would probably be able to identify in the first 100 or 150 pages at most. And at that point, if that bothers you, then you probably shouldn't be reading the rest of the book. So that's my take. Next up, next review for The Shining. We'll go in here. A little bit of a shorter one. This one says, the story itself would have been a 3 without being very scary, which is fine. Okay, thank you for saying which is fine. If not for how incredibly racist, homophobic, and misogynistic the language was. A lot of people forget that you can write things as a writer and not actually believe or feel the things that are being written about, particularly in the case of older American novels. And this is the case everywhere. It's not just American, but particularly American novels written when this book was, which was, you know, in the 70s, basically. Having things like the N-word, for example, is going to be a pretty commonplace thing, and Stephen King is no stranger to using that. But it's like using it in the context of characters and a world that makes sense. It's not just the author using it because the author feels things, right? That's my personal take. But if you get out of The Shining that it's racist, homophobic, and misogynistic, I think that's lacking grace towards the tone of the, not just the book, but like the world and the characters and the time period. Like you're reading it from a very 2020s lens as opposed to a 1970s lens. And I think that it is important to read books in the context of when they were written just as much as today. Like to hold a 50-plus-year-old book to the context of our exact standards today is a little bit, I've never been a fan of that. Anyway, there's no reason for a white writer to consistently throw the N-word in their book. I disagree, especially since most of the times it was thrown in this book, I can remember, were actually from the black character's POV. And when you're using a black character POV, fun fact, like people actually use this word a lot with each other, even today. So I would disagree with that critique. I'm kind of interested to read something Stephen King wrote very recently to see if he's changed even a little, but I also don't want to punish myself. Don't really have anything to say on that front. But yeah, I would personally say that if you're getting out of this book, you know, racism, homophobia, misogyny, that kind of thing, I think that's more the angle you're personally reading the book from than anything that's actually in the book. You know, if you have a problem with N-words in a book, then yeah, don't read it, I guess. But if you're going to assume that the word existing just because a white writer wrote it makes it racist, that's a very silly critique. I've never agreed with those kinds of takes. But anyway, we're going to move on to the next book, which is The Martian by Andy Weir. Okay, first review sent to me by Malrubius. Here we go. Malrubius apparently chose longer reviews, generally speaking, so interesting that I'm starting off with these, but here goes. How can I say this to you? This is one of the most boring books I've ever had the displeasure of reading. From the very first sentence, I'm a little bit surprised by that, because I was never bored reading The Martian, but moving on. I was really looking forward to reading this book. Everyone was so enthusiastic about it. I was saving it for myself as a little treat. By page 27, I knew I was in trouble. By page 27, that's like not even 10% of the way through the book. For The Martian, that's crazy. Anyway, here's the book. Okay, here goes. I'm going to be censoring these words, by the way, just because I don't love yelling them out loud in my house. A log entry. I'm effed. Oh, wait, I have an idea. Science, science, science. Then if I science, 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 science. Great. Insert lame joke here. Now imagine this repeating 1,000 times. To be fair, that's not entirely wrong as a distillation of part of the formula of the book, but that's also the joy of the book, if you're me, anyway. Watney's stranded on Mars. There's no one there for him to interact with. Also, he's apparently a person with no human feelings. I would disagree with that. Seriously, there's no doubt, worry, fear, anger, or despair. Wrong. Even though he's stranded on a desolate wasteland and his death is imminent. Again, I would personally say that that critique is wrong, personally. And that is largely because he has to force himself through the situation, and he does get quite upset a lot. It just happens to be the case of him using a lot of swear words to express that, and I think that that is valid. Mark Watney is a very particular personality. Anyway, Weir doesn't even make an attempt to channel human emotions at any point in the novel. I don't know whether this is because he's a terrible author, struggles with lack of feeling himself, or what I most suspect, that this is an extremely intelligent man's daydream about how someone could survive on Mars, and not a novel. The book is like a science textbook with random lame jokes sprinkled on top. No, more as if someone had asked Weir to write a thesis on how to survive on Mars and yet allowed him to throw in as many F-words and lame jokes as he wanted, which it is. It wasn't what I would consider a novel. On that particular paragraph, that's very interesting. I think it's basically just a simple matter of the exact tone of the book just not clicking with this person, which I think is completely valid. I understand why The Martian wouldn't work for some people, even though I like it so much. But I do think that's slightly uncharitable as to, like, you know, insinuating that maybe Andy Weir might not struggle or might not have feelings himself, which is a little bit of a weird one there, struggles with lack of feelings, or if it's because he's a terrible author. I could understand if someone felt that way as well. It's not like he's a seasoned author, even with Project Hail Mary. In fact, I think that Project Hail Mary is almost a ripoff of The Martian, for example. So, like, you know, there's some things to talk about in that part of the discussion there, but as far as, like, it's just a science textbook with random lame jokes sprinkled on top, obviously the exact humor style of the book didn't click with this reviewer, which, again, totally valid. That's personal preference thing. Horror and humor are like the two things where definitely it's very particular. You're going to have to meet a particular audience for that. For me, it worked in this case. I love Mark Watney. And as for being like a science textbook, I would kind of disagree. The book is a little bit heavier on it. Like, it's not soft sci-fi, but it's also not so in-depth on the science that, like, you inherently understand the actual concepts to their core, right? You just understand them as far as you need to for the book to work and make sense. But if you're really not into science, then yeah, don't read this book, for example, I guess. But yeah, interesting critique. Anyway, then you have Earth. What is going on there? We have multiple people on Earth. Perhaps these people will provide us with the dialogue and human emotion I'm craving. Nope, this is how Earth goes. Person A, science, science, science. Person B, well, my theory is science, science. Person C, we'll have to do science, science, science. Person A, F you. Person B and C, working for the government sucks. Ha ha ha. I would also disagree with this personally, just because when you have people in positions like that, you're not really actually, you don't have the opportunity to really be emotional. Like, if you're an emotional person and you were a higher up in NASA, for example, that might not be great for your job, actually. And being able to kind of work through that stress is important. And I do feel like Andy Weir gets stress, actually. I think he conveys stress very well in this book, and stress should be enough as far as emotions. Like, I don't want the characters who work at NASA to be crying at their computers, for example. That would be weird, actually. Anyway, that's it. That's the riveting emotion you get here. Not even a semblance of any human relationships or interactions that aren't based on scientific discussions. Well, it's because it's all about science. You have very higher up people in scientific fields having to work through a problem, and if they don't work through the problem, then bad things will happen. So, you know, you kind of have to make that work, and that's actually pretty realistic in my view. I was attached to and cared about exactly 0 people in this book. I didn't care if Watney lived or died. I didn't care if the people on Earth discovered he was alive or not. I didn't care. Nothing Weir wrote made me feel anything for anyone in this novel. Personal problem. I'm willing to bet that Weir is a very intelligent man and a great software engineer, but he's not a great author. Like I said, there's an argument to be made on this as far as, like, being an author is concerned, but I would essentially disagree. Anyway, this book was horrible. I could have easily and happily DNF'd at any point in this book. The only reason I made myself finish it was so that I could write this review and express my opinion as someone who had read the whole thing. Fair enough. I respect you for finishing the book. TLDR, boring, bloodless, and completely devoid of any humanity. Personal disagree. A textbook with some jokes scattered here and there. I can completely understand why my engineering friends IRL are going apeshit for this book. However, it holds no appeal at all for me. The movie, even if it sucks, will most likely be 10 times better than this. There's no possible way it could be worse. Well, interesting take for sure. I disagree with basically all of it. I like the movie a lot, actually, as well. So, I hope that Carmen liked it. But as far as the review, I respect you for finishing it, but basically disagree with everything. I think just the entire tone of what was being done throughout the whole thing just doesn't work for Carmen here. Fair enough. Who am I to disparage that? Anyway, let's move on to the next couple of reviews here. Starting off with one from Sporty Rod. Book club, not much happened, astronauts go to Mars, one guy gets left behind, mistaken for dead, he fights to survive. Good distillation of what happens. The good thing was that the science-y theme was explained using dumbass terminology. I guess that depends on what you mean by using that term. Anyway, none of the NASA people spoke like professionals. They were more like teenagers using more swear words than descriptive ones. I could maybe start to see why this is a critique, actually. But to a degree, I also understand that people are people, and actually, yes, professionals do speak unprofessionally sometimes, especially in stressful situations. I personally would provide grace on that. Like, I would not consider that an active detriment to the book, but fair enough. If this was to allow readers to understand the complex space situations, it worked, although it grew old quickly and it didn't seem believable that the world's smartest people would talk like this. Again, fair enough. I understand why that might be the start of a critique there, even if I don't personally hold it, but fair enough. The main character had no personality. He was shallow. I guess that kind of shares with Carmen's take there. I personally really disagree. He was constantly in a dire situation. Yes, because obviously, but his diary was about him trying to fix something so he can live and hope he doesn't die. There was no fear, no missing anyone, no last words to get out, just lame jokes. A class clown, too sanguine for the situation. What did the others think? Not much, mostly death stares, eye rolls, mez. There was little to discuss and lots to rant about. Ratings, I don't know what these 22111 are referring to specifically, but I guess you have just a particular, subset of people who aren't going to take to the humor, and therefore Mark Watney's general narration style. Fair enough. Like, I think that is actually a very fair critique insofar as, like, personal taste is concerned, even though it really worked for me. I do find the professionalism one is also a relatively fair point, even though, again, I would disagree for that in regards to just this being a book, right? But yeah, next review. Very short one. Ugh, I could not finish this book. Too many confusing abbreviations and math. I don't want to read math in a novel. I made it halfway through and give up. Again, completely fair. That is totally, totally fair, because this is actually fairly sciencey. It's just kind of funny that we got that alongside Carmen's review, which was just, talking about how it was all science, right? Because, yeah, of course, The Martian is all science, and if you do not click with the math and science of this book, even though I think it is actually very approachable for what it is, considering that it's talking about like astrophysics and that kind of stuff. It's very approachable, but if you don't want to read any of that in a book, totally fair. Don't read The Martian. That makes enough sense to me. Now we're going to move on to my number 8 read, which is I Am Number 4 by Pittacus Lore. Our first review for I Am Number 4 comes from Alicia, or Alicia, depending on how you pronounce it. Anyway, one of the worst books I've read so far in 2011, because, yeah, that's a pretty old review. A second only after Spells and Stupidity. I have no idea what that book is, so we'll just run with it. I suppose this is another case of a book with a decent concept, but incredibly weak execution of said concept. My main gripe with this book was that it just bored me out of my mind. I'm not usually a skimmer. I tend to read slowly and really absorb each word and sentence, but this book just had me itching to skim through large sections. Boredom aside, I found the characters and dialogue quite wooden, and the entire plot was rife with cliches. I don't recall, like, the actual details of the plot enough to determine, like, as far as cliches, like, that critique, that could totally be valid, for sure. I do plan on rereading the book and the series relatively soon-ish, just because I love it so much, and I want to reread the series. But as far as like being bored, and wanting to skim through things because like being a slow reader, really absorbing each word and sentence, I'm also one of those people. I'm also somebody who absorbs each word and sentence. I am a very slow reader, but I always plow through I Am Number 4. I believe every time that I've read it, and I think I've read I Am Number 4 3 times if I'm not mistaken. Yes, actually. I Am Number 4 flies by every single time for me. I generally read like most of it within a matter of like a day or two, like the vast majority of it. That is how quickly it goes for me. So for me, it's just a disconnect. I don't understand how you could be that bored with the book, but okay. The so-called romance between the protag and his love interest was ridiculous, cheesy, and bland. The love interest was the stereotypical, perfect, gorgeous, personality-less, blue-eyed, ivory-skinned blonde. She seemed to be valued mainly for her looks, as the reader has it hammered over their head over and over again that she's the most beautiful girl John had ever seen, blah blah, etc., etc. I suppose she was also valued for her supposed goodness, which was demonstrated to the reader only in the most banal cliche ways, i.e. she works at an animal shelter. She is semi-nice to the school outcast. At one point, she was actually described as fluttering her eyelashes at him. I mean, come on, who actually does that? I don't remember the fluttering eyelashes line, but fair enough if that's a real thing. As far as like the cliches described here, I could understand like being a little bit bothered by that, I guess. But for me, it's a matter of like, I guess maybe when I read the book the first time. And also, I'm generally not somebody who's bothered by cliches or even tropes. Cliches and tropes can totally be fine if they're used in, not completely bland ways. And I guess I just never found them to be bland in I Am Number 4, or didn't realize they were super cliche or tropes at the time. I don't know. Maybe these critiques are valid. As far as like the romance and love interest thing, the supposed romance of the book, I could understand critiquing that, I guess, but I was definitely invested with it personally, and especially by the last couple of books. I never disliked the romance, and as far as, considering the love interest to be the stereotype in a lot of ways, that's also fair. Like, honestly, I'm not going to argue with that point too much. I'm just not somebody who really cares very much about that particular thing. Anyway, moving on, I just had no interest in any of the characters. I couldn't feel anything for them. They all seemed like teenage cliches, not real people. Fair enough, I don't remember well enough to say that that's a critique, but I definitely didn't feel that way about this series as a whole, personally, anyway. In fact, the whole book had a distinctly teenagerish feel. Yeah, it's a YA book, which is not necessarily a bad thing for a book to be, and completely understandable considering it's YA, but that doesn't mean it has to suck. I don't think it sucks, and I guess that's just a personal taste thing. I enjoy plenty of YA and children's books, but this one was just, I don't know, immature, unsophisticated, one-dimensional, too commercial. Maybe some of those things could be valid, but as far as my memory goes, I would personally disagree with all those. But again, could totally just be a taste thing. The writing was serviceable, although again very bland and uninspired. Plus, there are some pretty questionable ethical issues when it comes to the authoring of this book and whether the author who wrote the bulk of it was fairly compensated. Okay, I don't know any of the background for any of that. I wasn't at all surprised to learn about the conditions that the book was written under, as that's exactly what it reads like, some kind of mass-produced commercial product coming out of a YA book trend factory. There's no handmade flourishes, no artistry, and no heart. It's like they just grabbed a bunch of cliches and popular YA trends, a love triangle. Love triangle, there's not a love... Well, only a love triangle insofar as, like, there's another dude interested in the gal. I don't think there's an actual love triangle in this book. I feel like I would have remembered that. Magic powers, yes, etc., and clumsily assembled them together. That's not writing, it's tragedy. I would disagree about that. I don't know about the background for compensation or the authoring of the book. Like, I really don't. And personally, not to be rude or heartless or anything, but I don't really care that much. I'm generally somebody who will usually look beyond those kinds of situations for a book to view the book as it is anyway. Like, in fact, if anything, I would generally be more inclined to provide grace on the quality of the book if it was written under poor conditions than included as part of the harshness of the review. So that's just my take, but fair. It just seems like the book didn't click for her for various reasons. Fair enough. I don't really have much comment beyond that. It's just a lot of the specific critiques she made. I don't remember the book in detail well enough to really make that much comment, other than to say that I don't recall any of those things bothering me. Here's our next couple of reviews. We'll wait for this to load. There we go. Okay, review from Rodar. This book is so strange and awful, it's hard to explain exactly why I dislike it. Thank God this book didn't live up to its height like Twilight did. At least I hope it didn't, because I don't really hear much about this one. I don't know what's specifically being said, like, didn't live up to its hype. Are you suggesting that Twilight did live up to its hype? Or... I'm confused. Anyway, I couldn't get past chapter 9. It was such a bloody bore. I personally couldn't disagree with that point more. It's usually around the chapter 6 point when I get so hooked that I read basically the entire thing in one sitting, which is something I never do. I decided to give it time for me to find that little spark, but no. 9. You only waited 9 chapters for it to give you a spark? I feel like I remember these books having like dozens. A few dozen chapters, so like maybe read like a quarter or a third of it maximum. I don't know about that. Anyway, now here are the problems. 1, lore can't use the word "and" in the proper way, which seems like it's not that big of a deal, I guess. But it is. He randomly places it and tries to get his readers to understand his reading, and it's quite awful. I would not remember this at all personally, but it never bothered me the several times that I've read this book, so whatever. The characters are all bland and pathetic. John seems to have a false sense of bravado. Henri makes me want to bang my head against the wall, and don't get me started on Sarah. The characters are so emotionless, no depth. I just personally disagree on this point. Just, personal tastes. 3, lore tends to forget the most significant details regarding his plot. It's like, oh, I forgot to mention what my powers are. Oh, wait, my name is... I disagree on that point. I might have to have like some specific examples, like what specifically those problems are in reference to, because as far as like I can think of, as far as like, John's powers specifically or anything like that, I don't think I agree with this at all, but it could be a lack of memory thing. His writing is dull and boring in every possible way. It reminds me of Fitzgerald's writing. Well, first of all, Fitzgerald's writing is good, actually, and I also just don't remember the prose of this book well enough to say whether it's good or bad. But again, when I read the series, and I've read the entire series once, and I've read most of the series a second time, and I've read at least the first book, I'm pretty sure, 3 times. Never bothered me any of the times that I've read it in the past, so who knows? Maybe I'll agree with some of these points in the future when I go through and actually reread the entire series again. Next up, this book's biggest failings are that neither the characters nor the story are compelling enough to sustain it. The story starts promisingly, although rather ho-hum, seen this all before, and it doesn't stop there. All the plot, quote-unquote, twists can be seen coming from a mile away. All this could be forgiven if the characters weren't cardboardy paint-by-number stereotypes, and usually is more forgivable if a film and not a book. Perhaps the forthcoming film will be more stomachable. On that point, I never watched the movie. I wasn't actually allowed to, which was ironic. My mom wouldn't allow me to watch the movie with the class, 8th grade class, when we were going to watch it after we read the book for class. Very funny how that worked out. But I've never seen the movie, and I actually don't intend to, so... oh well. It seems more like a novelization of a film script, precisely because there is no depth to the characters, and the whole pseudonym of the author of the book being an alien elder, barf. I actually kind of like, personally, that little... what's the word that I'm looking for? The gimmick of the author being kind of an in-world character, actually, in-universe character. I personally like that. It kind of made it interesting reading it back in, junior high and high school. But as far as like plot twists, I don't recall the book ever being focused on plot twists, so I don't know if I can agree with this point or not. And it seems like a pretty common critique here that people who aren't liking this book are finding the characters to not be good enough to sustain the book. And I would personally disagree. From my memory, I was always so compelled to read this specific book, to be able to read it basically in a day, for all intents and purposes. The very first time I read it, I legit read almost the entire book, like from chapter 6 or 7 on to the end in one night. I never do that kind of thing. So for me, obviously, this wasn't a problem. It didn't help that 40 pages from the end, I found out that the author was James Frey. I don't know who that is. Even when he's setting out to write fiction, he can't seem to succeed at it. No idea who James Frey is, so honestly can't comment on that particular critique. But that is I Am Number 4. Let's move on to The Failures by Benjamin Lyer. Okay, first review from Michael Culbertson. Bland language with an inconsistent tone. Among other issues, Lyer relies heavily on a formula of stunned declarative sentences repeated with italics to convey incredulity at the enormity of what characters are experiencing. The formula is thinly descriptive and becomes tiresome. I could understand people finding like a formula, quote unquote, of the book tiresome, I guess, but that kind of depends on what you mean by the formula. But I wouldn't describe it personally as inconsistent tone per se. It's that each POV group, I guess, has a very distinct tone and style given to them. And like I said, for me, that's not inconsistent so much as it is, it's very intentional. I don't think it's inconsistent because it actually serves kind of a purpose by the end of the book, in my opinion. Anyway, insistently repetitive in detail. Some of the repetition seems to be intended to evoke the ruminating thoughts of characters, but continual brooding isn't terribly interesting to slog through for page after page, and the internal reflections do little to develop the characters further than the original events over which they are brooding. Other times, the repetition seems to be intended to remind the reader of what was going on, or as a scrap of the last episode in the would-be serial, and yet other repetitions are part of the broader incredulity formula, or seem to be there simply to build and maintain a disdainful tone. Despite all the various functions, the endless repetition yields a sluggish narrative. I personally would take issue with saying repetition. There is a degree to which there is some repeated things throughout the book, but most of that it comes down to the exact way in which information is revealed, so as to help you, the reader, piece together what is going on, and more importantly, when things are actually going on. There is a very huge part of this book that is about putting together the order of POVs. And that means that some things are being repeated in some sense and also being referenced between certain POVs and revealed over time so that you come to understand all of that stuff in due time throughout the book. I personally would not call that repetition. It is very intentionally crafted to allow the reader to figure those things out. In my opinion, that was done incredibly splendidly. Obviously, Michael does not agree. Uncompelling characters, disagree. Sophie was the only character that seemed to have complex motivations. Again, disagree. For everyone else, what you see is pretty much what you get, mysterious backstories aside. Lyer makes use of name changes and non-linear storytelling to release a series of bombshell revelations of who this and that character really are in the latter part of the book. The first couple are interesting and satisfying, but the technique is deployed too many times and becomes mundane. Honestly, sounds like a skill issue. Okay, to be a little bit more fair, I disagree with saying uncompelling characters, and it is true that certain name changes in some spots and a lot of non-linear storytelling to release series of bombshell revelations is true. That is a very big part of what this book does, and if you don't like that, or if you're unsatisfied with that, then yeah, you're not going to like the book. So that's fair, but for me, all of it worked brilliantly. I thought that the technique worked every single time, to the point that I was able to figure out many of the reveals like a page ahead of time, like right ahead of the actual reveal, which for me was very satisfying, for example. But to say it becomes mundane, I would disagree with that, because you're constantly being like taken one way or the other. There are times when I was very certain of when certain things happened or what reveal was about to happen, and it was a different one, and I didn't feel hoodwinked about it. So again, like, to say it's mundane, I just disagree with that personally. Liar flits rapidly between narrative strands with very short chapters that rotate between character groups, often cutting the narrative just at the moment when the next portentous? Is that how that word's pronounced? A detail is revealed, though some chapters have very little that happens in them whatsoever. The short chapters were likely intended to build suspense, but the constant restarting of each narrative utterly bogs down the action. I think that's just like a personal taste thing, like how you would personally react to the various switching of POVs in the book, because I'm pretty sure basically every single chapter switches the POV. So if that's too fast for you, I think that's fair enough. For example, this is a critique that I made of Malice by John Gwynne, where I felt like the exact lengths of all the POVs and switching the POV every single chapter really struggled to work for me in Malice specifically, because I never was able to get grounded enough in any of the characters to actually feel like I knew them, because the chapters were a little bit longer. They just started to get to where I was getting into them, and then it was the next POV, as opposed to Valor, the very next book, and The Faithful and the Fallen, where all the POV chapters were very, very short, so I was able to bounce between all of them quickly enough, which allowed me to return to each of them quickly enough that I didn't feel like I was getting cheated out of any of that story. I don't know why that was a case for me specifically with those two books, but in the case here, like, I understand how that kind of going through all of those POVs and stuff like that every chapter could be a problem. Like, I don't agree with it, obviously. I think it worked. It definitely worked for me, but I understand why somebody else would be bothered. Finally, after slogging through 500 pages, very little is accomplished. The characters run around and try to kill each other, but no one is really all that much closer to the ultimate objectives at the end of the book. Granted, this is the first in an intended trilogy, but even in an extended epic, each volume needs to move the action toward the resolution in order to be a satisfying unit. I would disagree on this point, because there is actually the primary POV, which incorporates Sophie's character, which you called out earlier, which does actually have a big, it arguably serves the biggest role in the story from a organizing everything else around it sense, and that storyline very much has a resolution and like a climax. Maybe not resolution per se, but again, in a multi-book series, like, having a strict resolution in and of itself as a book isn't necessary. Actually, you need something usually, and oftentimes that can be a climax, but I don't think that I would personally not consider that I don't want to say it's not a valid criticism of the failures, but in my mind, it feels like that. Not least because all the other POVs also have their drive. They have their thing that they're going towards, and they do actually get to many of those points because of like the reveals and revelations that are made throughout the book. They all get to those moments, and those are basically the climaxes of most of the storylines. And I personally just think that worked. Anyway, on the positive side, the world is interesting and the conflict features a rich set of competing goals from opposing factions. Despite just wanting the book to be over already long before the last page, the ending did make me curious to know what happens next, but given the many flaws, these merits were not enough to make for a pleasurable read. Fair enough. Fair enough. For me, it was just that everything definitely landed for me very well, so I'm sorry that this guy did not enjoy the book. Anyway, let's move on to the next review. This book is a mess, 5 too many POVs, and a timeline that's a puzzle to piece together. The first 75% is a slog, making me work too hard. It's about kids refusing to grow up despite what's at stake. James and Sophie aren't dumb, just frustratingly stubborn, likely by design. The monsters steal the show, aware of the setup, but sticking around for the great food. Okay, so as far as this person's critiques, definitely just a taste thing, like 100% just a matter of like what this book is doing, not for this person. Like, if the first 75% of this book is a slog, making you work too hard, then you just don't want to work hard for a book, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, there are times when I do not want to work for a book at all, but The Failures is not one of those books. If you want to read the failures, you need to know that you are needing to actually work to put things together. The timeline and POVs and stuff are definitely a puzzle to put together. That is absolutely by design. And yeah, some of those characters are stubborn. That is true. And maybe you don't like those characters because of it. But for me, it worked, you know. Monsters stealing the show. Everybody has their different favorites of POVs. And I think that the monsters were good. So I'm glad that, you know, this person obviously enjoyed those POVs specifically, and also might take heart in the fact that the next book is called The Monsters. But yeah, just as far as like these critiques specifically go, definitely a case of like this person was not coming to this book getting the things that they wanted from it, or was not coming at it the right way to enjoy it. Like I'm so uninterested, where's the plot, these are just rebellious kids, blah blah blah, and you know, there's no need to too many POVs at a snail's pace. You know, like I said, just definitely not coming to the book on its own terms. Seems to be the case for me with this review, and that's okay. I started reading this because I saw it was recommended for fans of The Tainted Cup, which I've not read, by the way, and I can see how the comparison was made, but seldom have you found a group of more irritating, cryptic, grating characters. If I ripped out a page and wrung it out over the sink, it would drip cynicism. True. The world of this universe, this world of these books is very cynical. That is true. And if that's something that's going to really bother you, then totally fair enough. I'm not going to argue with that point. And I'm also not going to argue with the point of more irritating, cryptic, or grating characters, because to a degree, a lot of them are some of those things, and like cryptic specifically is one of those things. And like if that bothers you, then fair enough. I see why you dislike this book, just not something that I personally agree with. So yeah, next up we'll move on to the last book that we'll discuss in today's video. That is Return to Edan by Philip Chase, for which there is only one review actually. So yeah, we will end it off with this one review. Utter garbage. Oof. What a way to open a review for one of my favorite books of 2023. The world has been saved, the evil priest is defeated, the dragons are freed, good has triumphed, right? Well, actually, some of those things happen in the last book. The evil priest was defeated in book 2, actually. Except the good guy possesses a sliver of the power of God in him, which is making him do evil things because God wants to destroy everything despite being the power which created everything, sort of. This was so confusing and went on for about 500 pages too long. Okay, so it just misunderstood basically the conceit of the character and story. So congratulations. Basically, the entire story, or the first 600 pages or so, was the hero's friends chasing him all across the world, trying to catch up to him and save him from the power within himself. Rapist slash murderer priest doing the same thing, possibly with good intentions, ? We can't tell. Except we can tell he does actually believe in his goals, so to himself he has good intentions even if they are evil. So again, misunderstood the conceit of that. And the hero, quote unquote, he says quote unquote hero, going along and performing miracles with the power of God ? While trying to convince it that it shouldn't kill everyone. I feel like this person is coming from a very religiously cynical point of view, which whatever. This was the dumbest, most convoluted and nonsensical storyline. I'm sorry, if this was the most convoluted storyline you've ever read, you have not read very many books. And it gets worse in the last 100 pages. Actually, no, that's when everything comes together. Seriously, it gets much worse when it turns into a literal zombie apocalypse story. That's a very disingenuous way of putting it. So congratulations on misunderstanding the conceit. Again, this is perhaps the 4th worst book I've ever finished. I respect being able to specify that. That's kind of funny, actually. But as far as everything else, I think this person just very much misunderstood this book and series, what it was actually doing. And yeah, that is a personal problem for sure. I could not disagree more, just because this person very much misunderstood what they were reading, actually. This is not even a case of like, oh yeah, those are valid critiques, I guess. No, this person just misunderstood what the book's doing, so sorry, I guess. Anyway, that is going to end this video. Like I said, this is way long, and I did not get even halfway through. the reviews. So I anticipated that I would have a lot of them and it would take a while, just not quite this long. So stick around for part 2, where I will cover my top 5 favorite books and some 1-star reviews of those sometime probably in November, like I said. So we'll go ahead and cut this video off now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've been enjoying and having a fun time reading these reviews or experiencing these reviews with me. I really appreciate it. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.